In this week's parsha, we have the story of Milchemes Midyan. And now after the Milchama, after the Yidden took the spoils from the war, Elazar tells the Yidden various different dinim related to the spoils. And he speaks to them about the dinim of kashering the kelim, kashering the vessels that were brought back from the Goyim. The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying, in the parsha where the Yidden are being commanded about the dinim of Hagolas Klei Midyan, kashering the vessels of Midyan, the Ramban asks the following question. Why is it that the Yidden are being told the halachos of kashering the vessels of a non-Jew only by this war of Midyan and not earlier on, by the Milchama that they had with Sicha and Oig, where there they also took spoils? And surely amongst the spoils there would have also been vessels for eating, and therefore they should have also been told there the halachos of kashering kelim. The Ramban explains that the lands of Sicha and Oig were part of the land that the Yidden were going to inherit or going to keep, and that it was permitted to them, as the Gemara says, to have all of the spoils, including even things that were actually forbidden to eat. In fact, Amru Rabbi Seinu, Chazal tell us in the Gemara, that Kidli de Chaziri Ishtirilu, that they were actually even allowed to take from the spoils and eat, even parts of non-kosher animals, even bacon. However, Midyan was not going to be a land that they're going to conquer, they're going to take over. Rather, it was only in order to take revenge from them, and therefore, here we didn't have this concept that they were allowed to take from the things that were asur, and therefore there is also an isur, also a prohibition as far as their vessels are concerned. The Mefarshim ask, in this parsha, in the Milchama of Midyan, the Yidden are also being commanded not only about kashering the vessels of Goyim, but also the concept of toiveling kelim that came from Goyim. As Rashi in fact brings on these psukim, and the Ramban himself also elaborates about this point of toiveling kelim. So the question seemingly is, why is it that they weren't commanded earlier, again by the Milchama of Sicha and Oig, why weren't they commanded over there about the idea of toiveling kelim? Says the Rebbe, here we cannot answer seemingly the same idea what we just answered for kashering, that since by the war of Sicha and Oig they're even allowed to have the actual non-kosher food, and therefore they could have the non-kosher kelim. This is not a good enough answer regarding toiveling kelim, because toiveling kelim is not because of any prohibition that is absorbed in the keli, because the halacha is that even if it's a brand new keli that comes from a goy, also needs to be toiveled. Rather, the reason is, as it says in Yerushalmi, because the keli is coming from the tumah of a non-Jew and coming into the kedusha of a yid, these kelim need to be toiveled. So seemingly those kelim of Sicha and Oig would have also needed been toiveled, even if essentially the isur wouldn't have been a problem, but they still need to be toiveled. So why weren't the dinim of tevilas kelim mentioned in the Milchemes Sicha and Oig? Now the Rebbe says, even though the Ramban himself says that v'libi maharer oid loymar sha'atvilo hazu midivreim, that is, that the Ramban himself suggests that possibly toiveling kelim is only a midirabanon, and that the pasuk that we have in Parshas Matos regarding this is what's called only an asmachta. It's only a support that Chachamim use, but the actual thing is only a takana midirabanon to toivel kelim. And therefore this would perhaps say that you can't ask why isn't this said by Sicha and Oig, because the whole thing is only a midrabanan anyways. We're just using a pasuk as a support, so we can't say why didn't the Torah teach us this halacha. The Torah doesn't teach us the halacha at all. But the Rebbe says seemingly this isn't enough of an answer. First of all, the Ramban himself says he's not sure about this. He says this needs to be further studied. That means he's in doubt whether maybe it is perhaps midoraisa. If it is midoraisa, then once again, it should have been said in the story of Sicha and Oig. Secondly, says the Rebbe, even if it is only an asmachta, only being used as a support, the question could still be, why didn't the Torah put in the pasuk to be used as a support by the Milchemes Sicha and Oig rather than putting it by Milchemes Midyan? And either way, the Rebbe says, we need to still understand, why doesn't the Ramban himself point out and ask this question of what's going on with Tvilas Kelim? Why aren't they mentioned by Melchemes Sicha and Noig? The Rebbe says seemingly we would be able to answer this based on what it's known that not all mitzvahs were actually immediately given by Matan Torah. There are some mitzvahs that were given later, even all the way till the 40th year. For example, Parshas Nachlois, the laws of how inheritance works, only comes through the story with the daughters of Tzlofcha that we had, as we had in the previous Parsha, and Parshas Pinchas, and other mitzvahs. And therefore, the Rebbe says, we might say over here, that you cannot ask, why is it that Tvilas Kelim, the mitzvah of Tvilas Kelim, was not given earlier by Melchemes Sicha and Noig? Because possibly the answer would be that it's only by Melchemes Midyan, now is the time where this halacha, this mitzvah, is being instituted. This is similar to a concept we have generally regarding Matan Torah, that nitna Torah v'nischadsha halacha, that certain halachas take effect only when Matan Torah started. And the same thing could be said about other mitzvahs, that certain mitzvahs only come into effect at a certain time. So you can't ask, why wasn't this mitzvah told earlier? Because this mitzvah didn't start only until later, till the Eibishter decided now is the time, by Melchemes Midyan, now is the time when this mitzvah is going to start. If that's the case, why does the Ramban ask this regarding kasher and kalim? Why can't you say the same thing, that kasher and kalim, this is only the time when it starts? Is because it's mukhrach to say, there is a necessity to say that the concept of a isur, balua, meaning the fact that we know that a prohibition of food is not only on actual food, but even on food that's absorbed in a keli, this concept that would make the keli asur, and therefore there would be a problem, we actually know that it did exist already before Melchemes Midyan. How is that? Says the Rebbe earlier on in the Torah, in Parshas Tzav, the pasuk over there is speaking about a chatos, that's carbon chatos, that's cooked in a keli, and the pasuk says that an earthenware vessel that the carbon was cooked in needs to be broken. If it was in a klina choishes, in a copper keli, then it also needs to be purged and rinsed in water, etc. Why is that? Rashi explains, on the word yishaver, that it needs to be broken, is because it had absorbed the meat of the carbon chatos. The meat of a carbon, as we know, has a certain amount of time when it's allowed to be eaten. After that, it's called noisar. So anything left in the pot, anything absorbed in the pot, would now be noisar. Similarly, regarding the klina choishes, on the words umoyrag v'shutav, that it needs to be purged and rinsed, Rashi also says lifloit as bliasoi, to be able to get rid of that which it had absorbed. In other words, the general concept that a keli could absorb isur, and that that's not allowed, and it needs to be gotten rid of, we know already from earlier in the Torah. This is why the Ramban asks regarding this idea of kasher and kalim, to get rid of the isur that's inside of it. Why is it only by Melchemes Midyan that the Yidden are being told to be kasher in their kalim? Why aren't they being told earlier by the Melchemes Sicha and Noig? But again, as far as Tvilas Kelim, perhaps the time for this halacha didn't come yet. But the Rebbe says it's still not 100% smooth. Since the Ramban is generally speaking and mentioning both of these ideas, he is speaking about kasher and kalim, he mentions about Tvilas Kelim, why didn't he mention at least briefly this difference that exists between these two? That it was time already for the halachas of kasher and kalim, but not for the time of Tvilas Kelim. And that's why he's only asking the question regarding the kashering of the kelim, giyulei nachrim, getting rid of the isur that was absorbed in the keli. The Rebbe says similarly to this, and even more so, the Rebbe says it's not understood in regards to what some of the other Mefarshim answer of why it is that Tvilas Kelim was not mentioned earlier by the Melchemes of Sicha and Noig. The Rebbe does not go into all of their answers and the problems with their answers, but the Rebbe does say, in addition to the fact that there are questions on each one of their answers, and the Rebbe says this is not the place to discuss it, but a more general question that applies to all of them is, why isn't the Ramban dealing with this question? So yes, they all have different answers, but the question still remains of why didn't the Ramban address this directly? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this based on another two general questions in regards to the whole concept of Tevilas Kelim. It is known what the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer write, that when we sell the chametz to a goy for Pesach, we shouldn't sell kelim, chametz dika kelim. And that is because if you're going to sell the actual kelim to the goy, then when you buy back the kelim after Pesach, you're going to need to toivel the kelim. However, says the Rebbe, in the Nusach Shtar Mechira of the Alter Rebbe, it says clearly that we are selling v'chein kelim mechumatzim. We are selling the kelim that have chametz, clearly visible on them, actual chametz. In other words, that even the kelim that we sell to the goy, even these kelim of chametz, we are selling to a goy. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, we don't find that the Alter Rebbe should come along and say that after Pesach we need to go toivel the kelim. And practically, the Rebbe says, we don't find that people are toiveling kelim. The Rebbe says the Shar HaKoilel answers that since the Alter Rebbe himself tells us that kelim that actually have chametz over here he's saying clearly which kelim are being sold to the goy, kelim that actually have chametz on them. We also know that there's a halacha that a keli that you're not planning to kasher for Pesach, you still need to scrub it well and rinse them well, that you shouldn't have any chametz noticeable on it. Says the Shar HaKoilel, what would come out is that the kelim that you use for the Suda actually never end up being sold at all, because you should have been cleaning them from any chametz on it. And it's only kelim, klei Suda, only dishes that you use for food, for meals, are the ones that you're going to be chayiv to toivel. So therefore, in other words, the Shar HaKoilel is basically saying that it never ends up that you're going to have chametz on the kelim and therefore being sold, so therefore you won't end up having to toivel them. But the Rebbe says this answer is not understood. This halacha that you need to scrape, you need to clean off the kelim, applies to all kelim. And therefore, says the Rebbe, since kelim that you are going to rub off are not going to be included, according to the Shar HaKoilel, in what's being sold, then what was the Alter Rebbe referring to? Which kelim was he referring to when he's mentioning in the Shtar Mechira that are being sold with the chametz? In other words, make up your mind. If every keli you're going to clean, then nothing is being sold. But the Alter Rebbe says that there are kelim that are being sold. So we must say that the Shtar Mechira is basically dealing with if for whatever reason you didn't end up cleaning those kelim. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is saying if you didn't end up cleaning certain kelim, they do end up being sold to the guy. If that's the case, we're back to square one. The question, why don't we need to be toiveling these kelim after Pesach? Says the Rebbe, we must say that even though these kli suda that have chametz clearly on them are being included in the mechira to the goy, and yet for some reason the Alter Rebbe holds that they don't need to have tevilah. We need to understand why that is. Now the Rebbe moves on to another question regarding Shavuos. And the Rebbe says, we know that one of the reasons we eat milchiks on the first day of Shavuos is as a zeicher, to remember, to commemorate the fact that the Yidden ate milchiks on the day of Matan Torah. Why was that? Since the Yidden were just given the mitzvah of Shechita by Matan Torah, like most mitzvahs were given then, so immediately all of the fleishike food and kelim that they had became forbidden. Why is that? Because before Matan Torah they didn't have the din of bar zvicha. What this means is they didn't have the status to be able to shecht. Even if technically they would have done a shchita, they're not called someone that can shecht. And therefore any of the previous food would not be allowed to be eaten. Any meat, anything cooked with meat, and their kelim and so on. They also cannot go ahead on the day of Matan Torah to shecht new animals and to kasher their kelim, because everyone agrees that the Torah was given on Shabbos. Therefore, the only thing left for them to eat is milchiks. Says the Rebbe, we could l'cha'oira ask the following question: how could they eat milchiks? In other words, like this. The main question is going to be regarding cooked foods of milchiks. So the Rebbe says it's a doichik to say that they only had butter and milk, but not anything cooked. The Rebbe says, in fact, if that would be the case, that should have somehow been commemorated or hinted in the way we have the minhag these days, that we only have things that are not cooked of milchiks. But either way, the Rebbe says, seemingly they should have had to kasher their milchik kelim, because these kelim would have become asur from the fact that they wouldn't have been careful earlier of cooking meat inside of the same kelim, or perhaps even a mixture of milk and meat. The Rebbe says the truth is this is not a question. Why? Because it makes sense to say that when the Yidden leave Mitzrayim, knowing that when you leave Mitzrayim, you're going to be serving the Eibush at this mountain, you're going to be getting the Torah. Yidden were already being careful in the mitzvahs, even in the mitzvahs of basar b'chalav, and therefore they would have had separate dishes for milchiks, and therefore there is no isur in the dishes of any fleishik food inside of them, or of a mixture of milk and meat. Again, just to reiterate, the reason why it was a problem with the meat is because technically, even if they would have shechted, it wouldn't have been good enough. But milchiks, there's no problem. If they were careful before, the kelim are perfectly fine. In addition to this, says the Rebbe, there are certain kelim that generally, just because of their shape, the way they're made, they're going to be more usable only for milchika types of food. So clearly they had dishes that would have been good for milchika food. But the question that remains with all of this is, what about toiveling the kelim? Yes, it's all very nice that they didn't have to kasher the kelim because there was no isur inside of it, because I said they would have been careful not to have meat in those kelim earlier. But by Matan Torah, the Yidden, as to use the words of the Yerushalmi before, they went into what's called Kedushas Yisrael. So seemingly, because of this reason, they should have needed to toivel all their kelim, because these kelim previously weren't under the Kedushas Yisrael. So therefore, we have over here again the same question: how are the Yidden able to use these milchike kelim without toiveling them? The Rebbe says, we discussed many times, that we could learn from Pirush Rashi al Torah in Yonim Ufloim fascinating, amazing things also in the area of halacha. Now, even though we know Rashi comes to explain just Pshutei Shel Mikra, which therefore tells us that you can't come along and paskin halacha from those in Yonim of halacha which would come out of Rashi's explanation al derech hapshat. However, there are places where Rashi is bringing down things, not only sort of on his own explaining the pasuk with Pshutei Shel Mikra, but when he comes along and he says something like Rabbi Yiseinu Darshu, or similar expressions, which from this we understand that even though, yes, it's a drash, it is a drasha, that the reason Rashi is bringing it is because it's part of helping us understand Pshutei Shel Mikra, and that's why Rashi is bringing it, but nevertheless, it is something that also fits and can be learned also in the style of Rabbi Yiseinu Darshu, meaning we could use it also in the area of halacha. Says the Rebbe the same thing in our case, that the explanation for all of these issues with Tfilas Kelim could be understood from a Rashi in this parasha on these psukim. When Rashi brings this idea of Tfilas Kelim on the words where the pasuk says about the vessels that were brought back from the spoils of Midian, the pasuk says Ach b'mei nido yischata, that it needs to be purified, sprinkled with mei nido, the water of sprinkling. Rashi says Lefi pshutai, the simple meaning of the pasuk, why these waters needed to be sprinkled, was to purify them mitumas meis, from the tumah of a corpse. That is, that Elazar is telling the Yidden that these kelim need two things. First of all, you need to kasher the kelim. We need to purge those kelim, l'tahara mina isur, to purify them from the isur that they had absorbed. And then chitui, they also need to be sprinkled, l'tahara mina tumah, to purify them from the tumah. because it could have come in contact with a dead body. Then Rashi says, V'Rabbi Seinu Darshu, Mikan, that we actually learn out another concept from here. Sha'af la'achshiron min ha'isur hit in tvila. That the water over here is not just about making it pure from tumas meis, but it's also coming la'achshiron to make it kosher from isur. So what is Rashi telling us? Rashi is telling us here is that the idea of Tevilas Kelim is actually connected with Isur, with removing it in some way from the Isur that it had. La'achshiron mino Isur. But this seems to be very difficult, because the halacha is that even new Kelim need to be toivled, as we mentioned earlier, even if it never absorbed any Isur. And as the Gemara explains, that if you had old Kelim, and you made them new, as if they're brand new, it would still need to have Tevilah. In other words, something new still needs to have Tevilah, new Kelim. Furthermore, Rashi himself explains the words on the end of the pasuk, where it says that v'choil asher lo yaveh bo'esh, any vessels that weren't used originally with direct fire, ta'aviru b'moyim. What does ta'aviru b'moyim mean? Rashi says anything that wasn't used with fire and Isur was not absorbed in it. Rashi says clearly there was no Isur absorbed in it. Ta'aviru b'moyim means toivel it, and then that's enough. So the question is, if it's clearly speaking about Kelim, that there was no Isur that went into it, why did Rashi say earlier that the point of toiveling it is lachshiron min ha'isur? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first looking carefully at the words of Rashi, a diuk and lashon Rashi. By kashering the kelim, getting rid of what was absorbed from the isur, Rashi used the term litaharom mino isur, to purify it from the isur. So too, when he speaks about the idea of purifying it from the tuma, in the first pirush of Rashi, which he calls l'fi pshutoi, he says litaharon minatuma. When he then speaks about the concept of toiveling kelim, he uses the term lahachshiron min ha'isur. What does this word lahachshiron mean? The Rebbe says it's with this change of terminology, within one sentence basically, changing the term from letaharom to lahachshiron, by hag'olah, by purging it, by getting rid of the isur, he uses the word letaharom, and by tvila he uses the word lahachshiron. Rashi is actually explaining us this main difference between hag'olah and tvila. The Rebbe explains, the term tara is shaykh, it's used by something that had in it either tuma or isur. And therefore, when we're performing hag'olah, when we're removing the isur that was absorbed in the keli, we use that term l'tar, and we purified it now from the isur. What does the word la'achshiron mean? La'achshiron actually means to make it fit. It's a word of preparing something, getting it ready, like a hechsher mitzvah. The keli is now ready, it's fit to be able to be used. In other words, what Tvila is doing is not about taking out an actual isur that was in the keli. That was accomplished already through the hagala. Or perhaps there wasn't even any isur. As we said, in some cases, it may have been a new keli. La'achshiron min isur means we want to make this keli now fit for being used by a yid. In other words, we want to make this keli into a state where it's completely going to be out of the possibility for it. There shouldn't be any potential for becoming asur. In other words, it's going now into a new state where now it's going to be completely removed from the concept of isur. That is, when the keli was in the rishus of the goy, even if practically he didn't use it with isur, or as we said before, the Rebbe doesn't mention it, or as we said before, maybe it was used, now it was already, we kasher it. But the fact that it was by the goy, there was a possibility to be used with isur. And therefore, the fact that now it's going into the rishus of a yid, it's going into a use where there's not going to be even any possibility to use it with an isur, the keli needs now something special. It's a tvil lahachshiron to make it fit min ha'isur, again, from the possibility of even ever becoming asur. It's going in now to a whole new state of belonging to a yid where there's not going to be a possibility for isur. Where do we find this concept that we want to take something away, even from even having the potential of the Isur? The Rebbe says we find something in this very parsha, something very similar. In connection to the story of Midian. So the Torah tells us regarding the women of Midian, it says, V'chol isha yoidas ish, any woman that had relations with a man, haroigu, you should kill. And as it's explained, as Rashi explains, that this doesn't actually only mean any woman that practically had relations with a Yid, but even someone that ru'uya lihiboil, even a woman that was of age that could have had relations, even if she did not practically have relations, she also had to be dealt with. Says the Rebbe the same thing over here. We're speaking about a keli that has the potential of becoming osir. That's what lahachshiron min ha'isur means. Says the Rebbe, this is why even if we have a new keli, or even a keli that was used with cold rather than with heat, also needs to be toiveled, even though they didn't actually absorb any isur, because the actual fact that they were within the domain, they belonged to a goy, with this itself, they were roy. They were capable to become osur, and this is what we are toiveling now them toiveling these kalim from now, to remove them from this possibility completely. This connection to isur. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand all the questions that we had before. We have answers to all of them. Number one, why is it that Ramban is only asking this question regarding kashering kalim? Why doesn't he ask the question regarding tvilas kalim? Number two, why is it that we don't have to toivel the kalim that we sold to the goy as chametz? And number three, how were the Yidden right after Matan Torah able to use their milchike kalim without toiveling them? Says the Rebbe, remember the Ramban is actually discussing Rashi. He's quoting Rashi on the words V'chola shalayavi bo'esh. The Ramban is having a pilpul in the words of Rashi. In other words, the Ramban is coming to discuss Rashi's shitta, basically. Now, we just said that Rashi is of the opinion that the tvila is clearly lachshirun, to make it fit, mino isur, which we explained from having any connection, any possibility, any potential for isur. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why the Ramban doesn't have to ask the question, why aren't the kalim being toiveled by milchemes Sicha and Oig? Because the same answer he gives regarding Hagala, why they don't need to be kashered, and that is because they were even able to have things that were clearly non-kosher, and definitely the kalim of non-kosher things, is also going to apply to why we're not going to toivel those kalim. In other words, if by milchemes Sicha and Oig the whole concept of the isur didn't apply, even to the actual non-kosher things, so automatically there's nothing to discuss either about efsharius isur, of the possibility of an isur, which is the point of tevila lachshiron min isur. We're not even worried about the isur itself. There is no isur over here. So there's no point of discussing a tevila which is going to be lachshiron min isur. Just to clarify briefly, in the beginning of the Sicha, the Rebbe was going with the opinion of the Yerushalmi, that was saying that the point of toiveling them is to take them from because it's coming into the kedusha of Yisrael. And that's why over there we couldn't have answered that the Ramban said already that the Isser doesn't apply anyways. Because our question was, but what about the fact that it's coming to the kedusha of a Yid? But now we're learning differently the whole point of Tevilah. According to Rashi, the Tevilah is also lachshiron mino Isser. So if the by milchemes Sicha and Oig the whole Isser didn't apply, the Tevilah for lachshiron min ha'isur obviously also doesn't apply. What about mechiras chametz? Even though we're selling the chametz to a goy, the kelim chamutzim, the chametz like a keli to the goy, we're even giving him the keys to the rooms where the chametz is. However, when we sell him the chametz, we're selling it in a way that lechatchila know that after Pesach it's going to belong to the Yid again. The Rebbe says it's very uncommon that the goy should actually go ahead and use the sold chametz and the kelim. In fact, there are even acharonim that want to say that the whole concept of mechiras chametz is ke'ein ha'aram. It's almost like a little bit of a trick, but for chametz that's enough. In other words, not a regular sale. But either way, the Rebbe says, since the mechira is in a way that the goy practically is not going to be able to use the kelim, therefore you also don't need to have the tevilah, the toiveling it, lachshiron min ha'isur, to make it now fit from its state of potential isur, because as we said, there was no potential isur. In fact, says the Rebbe, if the goy should go ahead and use those kalim, then you're going to have a bigger problem. It's not only going to be a question of toiveling the kelim, you're actually going to have to kasher the kelim. And finally, says the Rebbe, in regards to eating milchiks on Shavuos, as discussed before Matan Torah, the Yidden were careful about basar b'cholov, and therefore, so their kli cholov, their milchik kelim, not only didn't they have any isur in them, not only didn't have any fleishiks in them, but furthermore, there wouldn't have even been any potential for it. The Yidden were not shayach b'chlal to the whole concept of mixing milk and meat, as said before. And therefore, their kelim, these milchik kelim, don't need to be toiveled because you don't have this concept of la'achshiron min ha'isur. We need to remove them from the potential that they had for isur because they never had that potential at all from the outset.